fade in, cold wind cutting through pine silhouettes. A single lantern sways in the darkness. They say the mountains can keep secrets, but this is something the mountains should have spat back out. On the night of October 3rd, 1927, a farmer named Elias Crow heard a sound that did not belong in any living throat. It came from the hollow just past the abandoned seminary, a deep, wet keening, rising and falling in slow waves, as if something beneath the earth was breathing. Elias dropped his lantern when he realized it wasn't moving closer. The sound was already inside his chest. Within a week, Elias was gone. His wife claimed he had gone to check on the livestock and never returned. But in the morning, she found his boots neatly placed outside the back door, still warm, as though he had just stepped out of them. The townsfolk whispered. They always whispered. But the record shows this. Elias Crow was the 97th person to vanish from the Pine Hollow settlement in less than 3 decades. No bodies were ever recovered. Not one. What we are about to uncover is not folklore. It is not the tired ghost story of an old mountain town. This is about a settlement that was designed to disappear its people piece by piece, generation after generation, under the watch of the very institutions meant to protect them. And in the heart of it all, there is a truth so old, so obscene, that even the trees refuse to stand too close. The Pine Hollow settlement was not marked on most maps until 1892, though the families who lived there swore their great-grandparents had been born under the same mountain shadow. No one could say exactly who founded it, or why the valley had no official road until decades later. The first written mention comes from a county ledger, a single-line item: land appropriation for the care of orphans and spiritual instruction of settlers to be overseen by the Mountain Ministry Board. That board was nothing more than 3 traveling preachers and a clerk from the state capital. They arrived with wooden crates full of hymnals, worn Bibles, and something else, heavier. Witnesses claimed the men carried sealed iron boxes into the hills on their first night, returning hours later without them. No one dared ask what they buried. The seminary was built within a year. It was not a place of learning, not really. Children attended until they were 13, after which some worked the fields, some left for the cities, and some, according to rumor, were called to remain within the seminary walls. The first disappearance was in 1900, a boy named Isaiah Pike. The official account stated he'd drowned in the river, but there was no water in his lungs, only soil in his throat. The sheriff, a friend of the ministry, ruled it an accident. More vanished in the years that followed: farmhands, widows, drifters who never made it back down the mountain. By the time Elias Crow vanished, the number had reached 97, but here's the part no one talks about. In the church's records, next to each missing name, there was always a strange symbol, a half circle carved into the page with 3 vertical lines slashed through it. No explanation, no translation, just a mark. Her name was Hester Vance, though most of Pine Hollow just called her Widow Vance. She lived in a leaning clapboard house at the far edge of the valley, alone since her husband's accidental fall from the quarry ledge in 1908. In 1931, a traveling census taker recorded a statement from her, an interview that was never meant for the public. It sat in a dusty box in the county archives for decades. This is what she said: "You hear 'em before you see 'em. Sounds like prayer, but not words you know. Deep, slow, wet, ain't no tongue I ever heard, and I been to Charleston twice. The preacher, the tall one with the bad eye, he took the older boys and girls down to the cellar on a Thursday night, always Thursday, always after dark. Didn't bring lanterns, just carried that little iron bell with the crack in it. You could hear it ring, but it felt like it rang in your head, not your ears. I saw the floor move, underneath, like something was pushing up from the dirt, wanting to get out. And the children, they didn't fight, they just stood still, like they was waitin'. The census taker's notes stopped there. But at the bottom of the page, in hurried pencil, he'd scrawled, her hands were bleeding when she spoke, fingernails torn, says she'd been digging near the seminary cellar last night. Hester Vance vanished 2 weeks later. The sheriff claimed she wandered into the forest during a snowstorm, but the storm came a full day after she was last seen, and in the church ledger, next to her name, was that same half circle with the 3 vertical lines. For decades, that symbol, the half circle with 3 vertical lines, appeared only in the church ledger. But in 1946, a forestry crew clearing storm, felled pines near the northern ridge, found it carved deep into a standing stone. The stone itself was unlike anything in the valley, slate, gray, flecked with silver. It rose 7 feet from the ground and was buried another 4 feet beneath. The carvings were shallow but clean, as if they'd been made with tools far sharper than any the settlers had brought. A local historian, Dr. Merritt Fallen, identified it not as a Christian mark, but as something far older. He found similar symbols in an 1811 surveyor's sketchbook, drawn in the margins beside notes about strange mineral formations and the humming ground in the Appalachian interior. Fallen theorized that the half circle represented a mouth not human, but geological, a gate to something beneath the earth. The 3 vertical lines were thought to symbolize the chosen, people marked for some kind of offering or passage. When Fallen brought his findings to the Mountain Ministry Board, they dismissed him in writing, calling his work unhelpful and dangerously speculative. Within months, his small home library, including all sketches and rubbings of the stone, burned to the ground. The official report blamed faulty wiring, but there's one detail the report omits. When the forestry crew returned to the ridge to continue clearing trees, the standing stone was gone, not toppled, not broken. Gone. In its place, the ground was sunken a shallow, oval depression, as if the earth itself had inhaled. And from then on, the disappearances accelerated. In 1953, long after the seminary's doors were nailed shut, a local mason was tasked with repairing the rotting floorboards of the old caretaker's cottage. Beneath the boards, inside a rusted tin box, he found a leather-bound journal wrapped in oilcloth. The handwriting belonged to one Samuel Croy, caretaker of the Pine Hollow Seminary from 1909 to 1916. His entries begin as mundane notes about repairs, deliveries, and weather. But by the spring of 1912, the tone shifts. March 6, 1912, the children have grown restless. They do not sleep well on Wednesdays. The Reverend says it is excitement for the Thursday lessons, but I have never heard a lesson taught in the dark. March 13th again, the bell. I am told to stay in my quarters when it rings, but the sound gets into my bones. I looked through the cracks in the floor, saw only feet, bare feet, standing in a circle, some small, some not. April 3rd, the earth moved last night, like a breath under the floor. I heard something in it. Wet, slow, like a heart beating in mud. The Reverend put his hand on the planks and whispered, "Not yet." May 1st, they took the Miller boy. No struggle. Just walked him down the steps. The air smelled of iron and rain. When they brought the lantern back up, the glass was cracked from the inside. Croy's final entry is dated June 19th, 1912. The floor is thinner now. I can hear it calling. If they ask for me next, I will not fight. There are no further pages, no record of his resignation. But in the church ledger, under June 20th, there is a new name added: Samuel Croy, marked with the half circle, and 3 lines. By the late 1930s, the ledger was no longer hidden in the church's archives. It was kept in the Reverend's private study, locked in a narrow cabinet with a single brass key that never left his neck. Only the inner circle of the mountain ministry was permitted to view it, and only during the quarterly reckoning. The townsfolk believed these meetings were for balancing accounts and recording births and deaths, but whispers leaked out from the few who had seen the inside pages. The ledger was more than a list of names. Each entry carried the same half-circle symbol, but beneath it were strange notations in a language no one recognized: curling lines, broken spirals, and ink blots shaped like teardrops. Then came the incident of Ruthie Paxton. She was 16 when she stumbled upon the ledger while cleaning the Reverend's study. By the time the Reverend found her, she'd turned pale and refused to speak. 2 nights later, she was seen running barefoot through the main street, screaming, "They already wrote me down." Her family claimed she left for Charleston to work in a textile mill, but no one ever received a letter from her. In the ledger, her name appeared 2 weeks before she vanished. After that, fear spread like rot. People began to dread even the smallest errand near the church. A misplaced kindness from the Reverend, a glance from one of the elders, could mean your name would soon be in the book. And the worst part? It didn't matter if you left Pine Hollow. Several whose names appeared in the ledger fled to other towns, yet they still disappeared. No bodies, no witnesses, just absence. In the winter of 1940, a man named Thomas Greer arrived in Pine Hollow. He claimed to be searching for his younger brother, Daniel, a surveyor who had been contracted to map the northern ridges for a logging company and who had vanished without a trace 6 months earlier. Greer was different from most visitors. He didn't stay at the church's guest house, and he didn't attend Sunday service. Instead, he rented a single room above the abandoned blacksmith's shop and spent his days walking the ridges, speaking to anyone willing to talk. Within a month, the townsfolk had learned 2 things about him. 1, Greer kept a notebook filled with sketches of the half-circle symbol, drawn over and over with obsessive precision. 2, he was not afraid of the Reverend. Greer claimed he had found the symbol carved into a tree trunk deep in the northern woods, nearly identical to the one on the missing person ledger. But around it were other carvings, spiral patterns, and jagged marks that matched designs he'd seen in an 1884 anthology of Appalachian folk beliefs. The book spoke of the mouth in the hollow, an ancient opening in the earth, worshipped by pre-settlement clans as both a giver of bounty and a taker of life. Offerings were made in 3s always marked first, always willing or made willing. When Greer tried to show the Reverend his notes, the church board called a special meeting. That night, the blacksmith shop caught fire. Greer escaped with burns on his hands but lost all his sketches. Still, he did not leave. Instead, he began knocking on doors after dark, asking a single question: "Has your name been written yet?" On the night of February 17th, 1941, Thomas Greer forced open the cellar doors of the Pine Hollow Seminary. The lock had long since rusted, but a heavy chain was wound twice around the handles. He cut it with bolt cutters, slipped inside, and closed the doors behind him. The air was damp, thick, and bitter with the smell of rust. The lantern light fell across rows of wooden pews stacked haphazardly against the walls, as though they had been cleared to make space. The floor was not stone, but bare earth, a deep, reddish clay that looked freshly turned, though no shovel marks were visible. In his surviving account, pieced together later from his personal notes, and the testimony of one man who briefly sheltered him, Greer described crouching and placing his palm flat on the dirt. It moved, not like something crawling, more like the whole ground shifted, slow and steady, as if it were breathing from somewhere far below. It pushed up against my hand like it knew I was there. Near the center of the room, Greer found 3 depressions in the soil, shallow, oval shapes, evenly spaced, the size of human bodies curled on their sides. Around each depression was the carved symbol, the half, circle and 3 lines, pressed into the dirt itself. Greer dug into one of them with his hands. Just inches down, he found strands of hair, still bound in a ribbon, and something harder, a tooth, smooth and human, with the root still intact. Then came the sound. Not from below this time, but from the walls themselves, a slow, wet knocking, like knuckles on soaked wood. Greer fled, and from that night on, the church elders began keeping lanterns burning in the cellar at all hours. 2 weeks after breaking into the seminary cellar, Thomas Greer returned not to the church, but to the home of an aging clerk named Milton Avery. Avery had once kept the ministry's official accounts, but had been quietly retired after an unspecified dispute with the Reverend. Greer found him bedridden, coughing blood into a rag, and far too tired to resist questions. It was Avery who revealed there were 2 ledgers. One was the public church record, the one the townsfolk whispered about. The other, smaller, bound in dark calfskin, was kept in a locked drawer beneath the altar. Avery had been ordered to write in it once every 3 months. This second ledger contained no sermons, no birth records. Instead, it listed dates, quantities, and a single word repeated hundreds of times, given. Beside each given was a number, always a multiple of 3, and a column of names matching the missing from the settlement. But the final column was the most disturbing. It held symbols instead of words, not the half, circle, but spirals, sharp, pangled runes, and crude depictions of what Avery called the open mouth. Greer pressed him for details. Avery whispered that the ministry had been keeping the balance for generations, that the disappearances weren't accidents, nor punishments but payments. The settlement, he said, had been built on land that was already listening, and the thing that listened gave in return crops, game, protection from sickness, but it always demanded its due. When Greer asked who or what they were paying, Avery shook his head and said, "If you write the name, it sees you." That night, Avery died in his sleep. The calfskin ledger was never found. After Milton Avery's death, Greer began scouring county and state archives, searching for any mention of settlements with similar disappearances. What he found was not a list of isolated tragedies, but a pattern. In 1864, the logging town of Brackett's Ford recorded 13 disappearances over 2 winters. In each case, the missing had been last seen near the church or the storehouse, both owned by a small religious board funded from outside the county. The final entry in Brackett's parish book, written by an unnamed deacon, reads, "The debt has been met. We leave at dawn." Within a year, Brackett's Ford was abandoned. In 1879, a farming commune called Hollow's Bend reported strange sinkings in the fields, long, shallow depressions, always in 3s. That same year, 9 residents vanished. The state census lists the remaining population as relocated under advisement. No forwarding addresses. By 1891, these outlying communities had been emptied or absorbed into what would become Pine Hollow. Records show that land deeds were quietly transferred to the Mountain Ministry Board, the reason given, consolidation of resources. But Greer noticed something else. In each case, Brackett's Ford, Hollow's Bend, and the earliest sections of Pine Hollow, the disappearances came in cycles of 9 years. And at the start of each new cycle, the first 3 names were always marked in some way. A symbol on the ledger, a stone carving, a note in the margin. The implication was clear. This was not the curse of one valley. It was an ongoing arrangement that migrated, took root, and fed wherever it was planted, and Pine Hollow, as of 1941, was nearing the end of another 9-year cycle. By the summer of 1941, Greer had pieced together enough of the pattern to know the truth. The next offering was imminent. The last 3 vanishings had occurred in 1932, exactly 9 years earlier. If the pact held, another set of 3 would be claimed before the autumn frost. Greer tried to warn the townsfolk. He spoke quietly in doorways, pressed his notes into calloused hands, whispered dates and patterns to anyone who would listen. But most turned away, muttering that he was bringing the wrong kind of attention. Some locked their doors when they saw him coming. Then in August, a girl named Clara Densmore went missing. She'd been walking home from the river at dusk, her hair still wet, her dress hem dragging in the dust. No one heard a scream, no footprints led away. Just a shallow, oval hollow in the dirt beside the road, as if something had lain there and then sunk straight down. Greer knew what this meant. Clara was the first of the 3. 2 more would follow before the harvest moon. He began keeping watch outside the seminary at night, noting every movement, every light in the windows, every faint ringing of the cracked iron bell. And then, on September 3rd, he saw it 3 figures, hand in hand, walking toward the cellar doors. One was the Reverend, one was a boy of no more than 12. The third moved wrong, bent, swaying as if its joints had been rearranged. When Greer tried to follow, the cellar doors slammed shut before he reached them. From inside came the sound, the slow, wet knocking he'd heard once before, and under it, something else. A voice, low and deliberate, counting 1, 2. The night of September 14th, 1941, the moon was swollen and red over Pine Hollow. The air was heavy, unmoving, and even the crickets had gone silent. Greer knew it would happen that night, the 3rd and final taking of the 9-year cycle. He hid behind the woodpile near the seminary, watching as the elders gathered at the cellar doors. There were no lanterns this time, only the cracked iron bell, its dull tone carrying into the ground like a signal. One by one, they descended into the dark. Then came a silence so deep it made his teeth ache. Greer crept forward and pressed his ear to the wooden doors. At first, there was only the muffled rustle of movement below. Then, a sound like wet earth sliding open, a gasp not from fear, but from something inhaling. The Reverend's voice rose in a language Greer didn't recognize, rhythmic and deliberate. And then, Greer swore he heard something answer not in words, but in a long, rattling exhale that seemed to come from far below the floor. When the taking began, it was quiet. 3 voices spoke in unison, 2 human, 1 impossibly deep. There was a scraping like nails on stone, followed by a thud that shook the ground beneath Greer's knees. And then he saw it, through a narrow gap between the cellar doors, a hand, if it could be called, that emerged, long, jointed wrong, slick with a dark fluid that steamed in the cool air. The elders did not flinch as it reached for the boy standing in the circle. The boy didn't move at all. The hand closed. The boy was gone. There was no struggle, no scream, only the sound of the earth sealing over again. Greer stumbled back into the shadows, heart pounding, certain of one thing. Whatever lived beneath Pine Hollow had not just been fed. It had been promised more. Greer didn't sleep after the 3rd taking. He sat in the dark of his rented room above the blacksmith's ruins, replaying the image of that hand, the length of it, the way it moved, the way the boy had not even tried to run. By dawn he knew he had only 2 choices: leave Pine Hollow and carry the knowledge like a stone in his chest, or try to rip the truth into the open before the next cycle began. He chose the latter, knowing it would almost certainly get him killed. His plan was simple but brutal. The Reverend's power came from secrecy, from the unspoken pact the townsfolk had accepted for generations. Greer would drag what Greer's idea was as reckless as it was clear. If the thing beneath Pine Hollow was accustomed to taking its offerings in darkness and secrecy, then he would force it to come for one in the open when the town could not look away. He spent the next week watching the Reverend's routines, noting when he went to the cellar, when the elders visited, when the bell rang without service. He also noticed something new. The Reverend's sermons had shifted, heavy with warnings about wolves among the fold, and those who stir the earth without calling on the Lord. Greer knew those words were for him. He needed bait, something or someone marked by the pact. The opportunity came when he saw a chalk mark on the door of Martha Kell's farmhouse. The half, circle, and 3 lines. Martha's youngest, Joseph, was 7 years old and small for his age. Greer's stomach turned, but he knew the truth. If he did nothing, Joseph would vanish into the dirt before winter. That night, Greer went to Martha's window and told her everything. She didn't believe him at first. No one ever did. But when he described the cellar and the 3 depressions in the soil, her face went pale. She told him she'd seen one years ago in her own barn, and she had covered it with hay until it sank away. Together they made a plan. Joseph would be lost in the town square during Sunday service. Greer would watch, and if the hollow came for him, the whole congregation would see exactly what they had been feeding. But Greer didn't realize the Reverend was already expecting him. Sunday, September 21st, 1941. The church bell rang at dawn, its tone heavy, the air thick with the smell of rain that hadn't yet fallen. Greer sat in the back pew, his eyes fixed on the small figure of Joseph Kell sitting beside his mother. The boy's shirt was clean, but his shoes were caked in mud, not from the walk, but from the hollow Greer and Martha had filled the night before, trying to confuse the pattern. The Reverend preached with an odd stillness, each word drawn out like a stone pulled from deep water. The Lord sees the debt, he said. The Lord takes his portion. Heads bowed all around Greer. Not a single person looked confused. Not a single person asked what debt he meant. At the appointed moment, Martha guided Joseph toward the churchyard, pretending to scold him for fidgeting. The boy slipped away toward the center of the square, exactly as planned. Greer followed at a distance, his hand gripping the small revolver hidden in his coat. Then the ground shifted, not in the cellar, not out in the fields, but directly beneath the square, under the boots of the gathered townsfolk. The earth rose in a slow, deliberate swell, and a ripple of heat spread through the air, curling the edges of the hymn sheets still clutched in parishioners' hands. Joseph froze, staring down at the bulge beneath him. Greer shouted for the crowd to look, to see what was happening, but before anyone could react, the Reverend's voice thundered from behind. The debt is doubled when the debtor hides the coin. And then it wasn't Joseph the earth reached for. It was Greer. 2 long, jointed shapes tore through the packed soil and closed around his ankles, pulling hard enough to crack bone. The townsfolk didn't scream. They didn't move. They only watched as he was dragged to his knees, the Reverend's shadow falling over him like a lid. The pull was relentless. Greer's fingers clawed at the dirt, his nails breaking against stones slick with something that smelled of rust and rot. The world above dimmed to a slit of daylight, then closed entirely. He was in the earth, but it wasn't earth anymore. The walls were warm, pulsing faintly, as if he'd been dragged down the throat of some vast, buried thing. Every movement brought a soft tearing sound, and he realized the surface he slid against was not stone but flesh, lined with shallow grooves that bled a thick, black ichor. The descent ended abruptly in a chamber so dark it felt solid. Greer lay gasping, his legs throbbing where the unseen hands had gripped him. He tried to stand, and the ground flexed beneath him. Something was in the chamber with him, not moving, not breathing. Just present, the air smelled wrong, layered with scents that did not belong together, burnt pine, stagnant water, and the copper bite of blood. Then came a sound the same slow, wet knocking he'd heard from above, only now it was deafening. A light bloomed, not a flame, but a cold phosphorescence seeping from the walls, revealing shapes that made Greer's mind flinch. Piles of bones, some animal, some too human in proportion to dismiss. Marks carved into them spirals, half circles, the open mouth, and then it spoke. The voice was not in his ears, but in his teeth, in his ribs. You keep the balance above, I keep the gates below. This is the covenant. Greer forced the words out. Why take them? The voice did not answer. Instead, something vast shifted in the darkness, and a single eye, lidless, black as oil, rimmed with a ring of pale fire, opened directly in front of him. The eye did not blink. It fixed Greer in place, and before he could draw breath, the world around him dissolved. His body was still on that flexing ground, but his mind was elsewhere, pulled backward, through years, decades, centuries. He saw the hollow before there was a town. The valley was raw and untamed, the air thick with mist that never lifted. A small band of settlers huddled in makeshift shelters, their faces gaunt, their supplies nearly gone. Children lay silent under damp blankets, their lips blue, and then it came, not walking, not crawling, but emerging, as if the ground itself had decided to stand. The shape was impossible to hold in thought. Too many joints, limbs that shifted in count, a torso that swelled and contracted like a lung. Its head, if it had one, was a ring of staring eyes, each glistening with that same pale fire. The settlers did not scream, they knelt. One man stepped forward, a figure Greer recognized from an old, faded portrait in the seminary's archives, Elias Wren, the founder of Pine Hollow. Wren spoke in the same broken language Greer had heard in the cellar, his voice trembling but resolute. The thing listened, and then, impossibly, it nodded. In exchange for food from the earth, for clean water that ran even in drought, for winters mild enough to survive, the settlers would give it 3 lives every 9 years. Chosen by the marked stone, delivered without resistance, Greer saw their first offering a mother, a crippled man, a boy no older than Joseph Kell. The thing took them gently, almost reverently, lowering them into the soil as if planting seeds. When the vision faded, the eye still held him, and in the silence that followed, Greer understood something worse. This was not a bargain born of desperation. It was worship. The vision bled away, leaving Greer once more in the heaving dark. The eye loomed closer, its rim of pale fire pulsing like a slow heartbeat. He felt his thoughts being sifted, memories lifted and turned over, examined like stones in a riverbed. You have seen the covenant. The voice thrummed inside him. It does not break, it only changes hands. Greer's mouth was dry, his voice a rasp. You keep the Reverend alive because he delivers your tithes. The voice finished. I keep the gates sealed. I keep the hunger below from reaching the world above. The eye's light expanded until Greer could see more of the chamber. There, half embedded in the pulsing walls, were the remains of others, men and women who had stood where he stood now, their faces frozen mid-breath. Some wore the tattered collars of clergy. Some still clutched the fragments of books, rosaries, charms. Your Reverend is old. The voice continued. The flesh thins. The faith wanes. You came to unbind what cannot be undone. Instead, you will bind it anew. Greer shook his head, but the voice pressed deeper, curling into the places he kept hidden, the fear, the helpless rage, the gnawing guilt over every name he'd written in his ledger but could not save. Serve, and I will give you 9 years for every 3 you feed me. You will not hunger, you will not age, you will be the hand between the living and the pit." For a moment, Greer felt the temptation in his bones, the cold, hollow relief of survival without end. But then he saw Joseph's face, pale in the square, and Martha's eyes as she'd agreed to the plan. He spat into the shifting floor. "I'd rather rot." The eye did not blink. It only narrowed, and the chamber began to close in. The walls pressed inward, slow but deliberate, as though the chamber itself were breathing him out. The air thickened, each inhale dragging in the scent of scorched wood and wet copper. "Refusal does not absolve," the voice said. "It condemns." The ground under Greer liquefied, sucking at his boots. He fought to keep his footing, but the floor had become a membrane, slick and yielding. Shapes shifted beneath it, not bones, but bodies, moving faintly, as if dreaming. Faces broke the surface for an instant, their eyes clouded, mouths moving soundlessly before sinking again. One of them was the boy from the third taking. His lips formed Greer's name before he vanished beneath the black sheen. The eye dimmed, its pale ring shrinking to a pinpoint. Then came the final blow, not physical, but a flooding of memory that wasn't his. He saw the next cycle, 9 years hence. Joseph Kell's face, older, resigned, as the townsfolk stood in their perfect circle. The Reverend was gone, and in his place, standing in the same black coat Greer now wore, was himself. The vision was a promise, not a warning. He tried to scream, but the chamber expelled him. The membrane split, and he was thrust upward through choking soil, breaking the surface into the square. The congregation still stood as before, eyes unblinking. Only the Reverend smiled. "You've seen it." The old man said softly, "Now you understand." Greer's body shook, dirt in his lungs, the echo of the eye burned into the backs of his own. He wanted to tell them what he'd seen, to rip the silence apart, but when he opened his mouth, the only thing that came out was soil. Greer did not leave Pine Hollow. At first, he told himself it was to watch, to warn, to find some way to break the chain. But weeks bled into months, and the truth revealed itself in small, sick ways. The Reverend's gaze no longer weighed on him, yet the townsfolk began to glance at him, the way they once had at the old man, a faint, knowing deference. He found himself waking in the night, barefoot in the square, dirt under his nails with no memory of walking there. The cellar beneath the church seemed to breathe when he passed, and in his dreams the eye waited, never blinking, showing him the stone, the marks, the faces of the next chosen. By the spring thaw, the Reverend was gone. No grave, no farewell, just a vacant pulpit and the heavy, expectant hush of a flock who already knew their new shepherd. Greer tried to leave, then truly tried, walking out past the timberline, past the hunting posts, into the thin, brittle air beyond the ridge. But by dusk, the mist closed in, and he found himself stepping into the square from the opposite side, the church bell ringing without a hand on the rope. The first mark appeared on a door 2 weeks later. 3 lines and a half, circle, his hand had drawn it. That night, in the black hollow beneath the church, he heard the voice again, 9 years. He did not argue, and so the record holds, from 1896 to 1923, 7 people vanished from Pine Hollow. From 1923 to 1950, there were 7 more. No one ever left, and the hollow never slept.